the farmer's daughter who stole the Duke's heart. What would you do if the world told you that your destiny was already written? That because you were born in a small wooden house, far from the golden halls of the nobility, your place would forever remain in the dirt, in silence and in obedience. This is the story of a girl who refused to bow to such a fate. She had no crown, no titles, no power. And yet, her spirit was brighter than the torches of the royal court. The daughter of a farmer, whose hands carried the weight of the land, dared to face a society that treated her as invisible. And in doing so, she caught the attention of a man who should have never even looked her way, the Duke of Ravenshire, a figure feared and admired in equal measure. Their meeting was not destiny, it was rebellion. And from this rebellion, a love was born that could tear down everything the kingdom held sacred. The kingdom of Edristel was built upon divisions carved deep into stone. At the top stood the royal family, glittering like stars untouchable, their lives defined by silk, jewels, and whispers of power. Beneath them, dukes and marquises ruled vast lands, their names spoken with both reverence and fear. Barons controlled villages, knights enforced the will of their lords, and at the very bottom, so low the court pretended not to see, lived the farmers, the seamstresses, the healers, and the maids. Among these forgotten souls was a girl named Elira. She was no stranger to hardship. From dawn to dusk, her days were filled with the rhythm of the earth, plowing soil, gathering crops, carrying baskets heavier than her own body. Yet, unlike others who accepted their place, Elira's gaze was never fixed downward. She looked forward, always forward, her eyes sharp as though she were measuring a world that refused to measure her back. The villagers whispered about her. Some admired her strength, calling her stubborn fire. Others muttered that such fire was dangerous in a woman, that it would only bring ruin. But Elira did not live for their approval. She lived for the silent promise she made to herself each morning. I will not die as just another shadow in the fields. Her father, a man worn by years of toil, would sometimes watch her with worry. Elira, he would sigh, our lives are not meant to change the world, we are meant to survive it. But she only smiled, her hands still busy with work, and answered, then I will survive in my own way. What she didn't know was that her defiance, her refusal to kneel to a world that thrived on submission, would one day echo through the gilded halls of power. And that echo would reach the ears of a man who lived far from her world, yet carried a darkness that even gold could not hide, the Duke of Ravenshire. Elira's life was not one of softness or comfort. The seasons dictated her every breath, merciless winters that bit at her skin, scorching summers that left her hands blistered from the fields. Each day she fought not for glory, but for survival. And yet, there was a dignity in the way she carried her burdens, as though even hardship could not bend her spirit. From a young age, she had learned to take on the duties of the household. Her mother, lost to illness, left behind a silence that only Elira could fill. She rose before dawn to fetch water, prepared meals from scraps, and kept her younger siblings fed while her father struggled to maintain the farm. There were days when food was scarce, when the children's cries for bread tore at her heart. But even then, she never allowed despair to claim her. The villagers noticed her resilience. When roofs leaked, Elira climbed ladders to patch them. When fields withered, she sought out herbs and remedies to coax life from the soil. She became the one people turned to when trouble came knocking, not because she was obliged, but because she would not turn away. For her, strength was not a choice. It was survival painted as defiance. But her independence came with a price. Many of the men in the village regarded her with suspicion, even disdain. Too proud, they said, too stubborn for her own good. Suitors avoided her, intimidated by her refusal to bow her head. Women, too, whispered behind her back, questioning why she worked alongside men in the fields instead of dreaming of marriage or a nobleman's protection. Elira did not answer them. In truth, she carried her own secret fears. At night, when the world was still, she sometimes wondered if she had doomed herself to loneliness. If her spirit, so unwilling to bend, would forever keep her apart from the world she longed to touch. Yet in those same moments she would remind herself, better to be alone in truth than chained by lies. It was this same spirit that set her apart from the rest. While others accepted their fate as commoners, Elira believed there must be more. She devoured every scrap of knowledge she could find. Old books borrowed from the priest, overheard conversations about noble affairs, stories of great women who had changed history. She imagined herself not in gowns or jewels, but as a voice that could not be silenced. Still, dreams were fragile things in a world that belonged to men with titles, and Elira knew too well the dangers of standing out. The last girl who dared to challenge her lot had been cast aside, her family punished for her defiance. Power was a cruel master in Edristel, and it demanded obedience. And yet, no matter how much fear tried to creep into her heart, Elira's fire only grew. She was a farmer's daughter, yes, but she was also a storm waiting to be heard. She had no idea that her storm would soon collide with another. A man cloaked not in soil and sweat, but in armor and shadows. A duke whose gaze could cut sharper than any blade, and whose heart was said to be as frozen as the northern snows. The Duke of Ravenshire was a name that traveled farther than his armies. To the common folk, he was a shadow wrapped in steel, stern, unyielding, and dangerous to cross. Tales whispered in taverns spoke of his victories in distant battles, of his ruthless judgments, and of the coldness in his eyes. Some called him protector of the realm, others, a monster cloaked in velvet and iron. Few had ever seen the man beyond the title. For Elira, he was nothing more than a distant figure, a rumor, a story meant to remind peasants of their place, until the day their paths collided. It was harvest season when the village received word that the Duke himself would pass through their lands. His visit was said to be brief, a simple inspection of the estate that technically belonged to him. Still, the air in the village shifted, filled with tension and awe. Farmers scrubbed their homes, mothers hushed their children, and men bowed their heads as if the mere thought of defiance might bring ruin. Elira, however, did not bow. She had no reverence for titles. What was a duke to her, except another man born into fortune, his hands untouched by soil, his heart insulated by power? She expected nothing from him, and in truth, cared little for his presence. Yet fate is not so easily dismissed. On that morning, a cart had overturned near the main road leading to the village. Elira, strong as any man, rushed to help lift the wheel, her brow damp with sweat, her arms straining with effort. The crowd parted in silence as a procession of riders approached, black horses adorned with the crest of Ravenshire. At their head rode a man cloaked in dark armor, his gaze sharp as if he could cut through stone. The Duke dismounted, his boots striking the earth with authority. His eyes scanned the crowd with the cold detachment of one accustomed to obedience, until they fell upon her. Elira did not look away. Her hand still pressed against the cart, dirt smudged across her cheeks, strands of hair clinging to her skin. There was no fear in her expression, only defiance. For the first time, the Duke's mask of indifference cracked, not enough for others to see, but enough for him to feel. "Why are you not kneeling?" His voice was low, steady, but with an edge that silenced the murmurs around them. The villagers gasped, horrified at her audacity. To defy a duke was to invite ruin, yet Elira's reply came without hesitation. "Because my hands are busy doing work that keeps your land alive. Should I drop it all to bow, my lord?" A dangerous stillness followed. The guard shifted uneasily, awaiting his wrath. But instead, the Duke studied her. This common girl who dared to meet his gaze, whose spirit burned hotter than the summer sun. Something unfamiliar stirred within him, something he could not name. Admiration, amusement, or perhaps the faintest crack in the fortress he had built around his own heart. With a wave of his hand, he dismissed his men's tension. "Carry on," he said, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned away. But for Elira, that single exchange was enough to change everything. For the first time in her life, she had stood against the weight of nobility and not been crushed. And for the Duke, a seed had been planted, a dangerous curiosity, one that would draw him back to the village again and again, until the lines between duty and desire blurred beyond recognition. The Duke returned to Ravenshire Hall with a thought he could not quiet. the girl who would not kneel. He told himself it was curiosity, a passing fascination with an anomaly in a world of obedience. Yet days later, his horse found the same road again. And then again. Each time he told his men it was an inspection. Each time his gaze sought only one figure. Elira noticed the pattern, though she pretended not to. She continued her work as if nothing had changed, patching roofs, binding sheaves, trading herbs at the market, while the noble crest passed like a storm cloud that refused to rain. But storms always break. One evening, as dusk spilled violet across the fields, she saw him dismount alone, the guards keeping their distance. The air between them felt charged, as if the kingdom itself held its breath. "You're far from your hall, my lord," she said, wiping grain dust from her hands. "And you are far from fear," he answered. "Is that why people listen when you speak? They listen because no one else does." Elira met his eyes. Not even the men who own the land they work. A wry line flickered at his mouth. "You speak as if you intend to change that." "I intend to change what I can reach," she said, "and I can reach more than you think." They spoke then, not as a noble and a peasant, but as two people who recognized something dangerous in each other, a refusal to accept the world as it was. He asked about crop rotations. She told him which taxes strangled the poorest winters. He asked who the village feared. She said, "Not you. What we fear is being forgotten." When he left, the field felt emptier than before. Elira told herself it was nothing, a conversation, a flicker of attention from a man who lived in another sky. But the next evening came with a folded note hidden in a basket of grain, delivered by a stable boy with eyes too honest to lie. "By the old willow when the moon rises." No seal, no signature, just the certainty of who had written it. Elira went, not because she trusted him, but because she needed to know why a man with the power to erase her village from maps would waste time learning its names. They met at the river bend, beneath a willow whose branches curtained the night. Without armor and retinue, the Duke seemed less like a legend and more like a man who had forgotten how to rest. He listened when she spoke. She listened when he didn't. He admitted there were battles he had won that tasted like loss. She admitted that strength felt loneliest when it could not be shared. Their meetings multiplied, careful as stolen breaths. They spoke of crop yields and court intrigues, of his mother's illness and the winter Elira learned to split wood with frozen fingers, of the law that demanded kneeling and the dignity that refused it. She began to see the cracks in the iron, the quiet grief behind his precision, a goodness sharpened by years of duty. He began to see the fire behind her calm, the ache of carrying others, the stubborn tenderness that made her dangerous to any order built on silence. Rumors, like seeds on the wind, found soil. A merchant claimed he saw the Duke riding alone at twilight. A maid insisted she glimpsed a peasant girl near the north gate. The baron who administered the estate, Lord Carden, started asking questions with a smile too thin to be kind. "Your Grace seems moved by rustic matters of late," he said, bowing low enough to hide his contempt. "Shall I ensure the villagers remember their place?" The Duke's voice was ice. "Ensure they survive the winter. That is their place." Carden's eyes hardened. He had made a fortune reminding the poor that obedience was cheaper than bread. A benevolent Duke threatened more than custom. It threatened profit. He wrote letters. He visited the court. He whispered to anyone who liked their wine diluted with malice. Elira felt the pressure first. Prices rose without reason. The priest preached obedience with a new ferocity. A cart of theirs was accidentally turned away at the manor storehouse. Her father's worry sharpened into anger. "This is because of you," he said, the words heavy as stones. "You and your ideas. You and your pride." "It is because of their greed," she replied, though the words trembled. "If we bow deeper, they will only press harder." "And if they break us," he whispered. "If they break you?" That night she did not go to the willow. She hid the note and the ache that came with it. She told herself this had been a mistake, a dangerous weakness dressed like hope. But when the moon rose again, she found herself walking the river path, pulled by something that felt less like desire and more like a question she could not bear to leave unanswered. "You shouldn't be here," she said, when the Duke stepped from the shadows. "Nor should you," he answered softly. "Yet here we are." He spoke then not as a lord, but as a man who had reached the edge of himself. "They will use you to wound me. They already are. If you ask it, I will stop coming. But if I stop, Elira, I fear I will forget the sound of an honest voice." She closed her eyes. Honesty is a luxury the poor cannot afford, and yet it was all she had ever owned. "I don't need a savior," she said. "I need a man who keeps his word." "Then hear mine," he said. "I will protect your village, open the storehouses, reduce the levy. I will do it publicly, so no one can use my mercy as a weapon against you. And I will do it because it is right, not because you asked." She searched his face for the lie and found only its absence. The promise was a door. Stepping through it would change the shape of her life. "If you do this, they will come for you," she said. "For us." "Let them come for me," he replied. "You have carried enough." When the decree went out, new terms for tenants, grain released without bribe, joy broke through the village like daylight. But joy makes noise, and noise draws wolves. Lord Carden submitted a formal complaint to the Royal Council, accusing the Duke of favoritism toward a peasant agitator. A courtier with a talent for venom sent word to the capital. The Duke of Ravenshire had grown soft, perhaps romantically compromised, perhaps politically dangerous. Elira's life grew smaller even as her world grew brighter. She timed her steps, masked her smiles, and learned which shadows liked to move. The Willow meetings became rarer, more urgent. A touch at parting felt like a promise made on a battlefield. True, but costly. Then came the first open strike. A barn burned on the edge of the village. No lives were lost, but the message was clear: bow or burn. Elira helped form a line with buckets from the river, her voice steady, her hands blistering. When the flames died, the ash left a word on the ground, as if written by spite itself: "Kneel." The Duke arrived at dawn. He dismounted into silence, surrounded by faces that expected for the first time, not indifference, but justice. His gaze found Elira through the smoke. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that moment, the forbidden thing between them ceased to be a whisper. It became a vow, for the village, for what was right, and whether either admitted it aloud, for each other. But vows have enemies, and in the glittering halls far from that scorched field, enemies had already begun to move their pieces. The investigation was swift and precise, too precise for a simple barn fire. The Duke sent riders to question merchants, patrolled the garrison himself, and cross-checked the storehouse ledgers. In a week, he had what he needed, not a culprit, but a pattern. The taxes Carden could not lower had quietly lined 3 noble pockets. Grain marked as spoiled had been sold at a profit 2 counties away. The barn that burned belonged to the only tenant who'd spoken openly in Elira's defense. None of it was proof enough for court. All of it was truth enough for a reckoning. He called for a public audit at Ravenshire Hall, a spectacle most lords avoided. Ledgers laid open like wounds. Clerks recited numbers in careful voices while peasants watched from the back, unsure if they were witnessing justice or the prelude to punishment. Carden stood immaculate in his silver-trimmed coat, oozing courtesy. "Your Grace," he said smoothly. "The commoners won't understand the complexities of estate management. Best to spare them confusion." "They understand hunger," the Duke replied. "I trust their arithmetic." A murmur rippled through the hall. Carden's mouth tightened. "If we're parading vulgar grievances, shall we also parade rumors? It is said your Grace has been entertaining counsel from a village girl, under the willow, at night." All eyes shifted. The trap was sprung, and Elira's name lay just beyond Carden's teeth. The Duke did not flinch. "I take counsel where I find wisdom," he said, voice iron. which is precisely why you find none in me." Laughter cracked the tension, brief, risky. Carden bowed, the gesture a blade. "Then perhaps your grace will indulge one final formality," he signaled. Guards brought forth a small iron coffer. Inside, wrapped in linen, lay a signet ring, the crest of Ravenshire, recast. "We found this near the burned barn," Carden said softly. "A forgery of your seal, used, I fear, to authorize those charitable releases of grain." A collective intake of breath. The implication was clear. Mercy as crime, forged as law. It was a perfect scandal. Weaponize the Duke's goodness against him and tie the knot around his neck. For a heartbeat, the hall held stillness like a bowstring drawn back. Then the Duke spoke. "Summon the blacksmith," he said, "and the steward." His gaze swept the room and landed on a clerk near the back, thin, anxious, with ink-stained fingers. "And you, bring the draft ledgers from last winter." The clerk startled. "Me, your grace?" "You," he repeated. "You've been erasing numbers that don't fit." Color drained from the man's face. I only copied what I was given." "Into ash?" the Duke asked mildly. "Curious ink you use." The clerk broke. Words tumbled. Carden's orders. Extra tallies added after midnight. The ring cast with the Manorsmith's mold and cooled in a bucket of rye. It wasn't a confession so much as a flood. By the time he finished, the hall knew two truths. The forgery was Carden's snare, and the fire was meant as a warning that read, "Kneel in flames." "Arrest him," the Duke said. Carden didn't fight. Men like him never expected the blade to turn. But as guards seized his arms, he smiled. "Your Grace, this display solves nothing. The capital buzzes. They already believe you compromised by a peasant girl. Today you prove them right. You staged charity to win a commoner's favor and crushed a loyal administrator to impress your little audience." The Duke stepped closer, his voice low. "I did not free grain to win a heart. I did it because starving people make poor subjects and worse ghosts. As for loyalty, yours is to profit, not law." Carden's final dart flew true. "Then prove your impartiality," he murmured. "Show them she means nothing. Put the peasant on the stand and let her drown in the court's laughter. Or keep protecting her and watch your title burn with her barn." The room spun around a silence. For the first time, the Duke looked humanly wounded. He knew what came next. Petitions to the Royal Council, the court's appetite for scandal, the wagon of rumor already rolling downhill. That night, beneath the willow, he spoke without armor. "They will strike where I am weakest," he said, "which is where I am most honest." "And where is that?" Elira asked. He answered her with the truth she feared and needed. "You." Silence stretched, filled only by the river's dark song. "Elira," he continued, "I can weather their accusations. I cannot watch you become their proof. If I name you as advisor, they will sneer. If I keep you unnamed, they will invent worse. There is one way to turn their cruelty into consequence." She understood before he said it. "Make it official." "Make it legal," he corrected gently. "A formal position. Steward to the tenants. Paid, sworn, protected by law. Your voice at the estate court. You will stand where they can see you and where I can shield you." She laughed once, the sound catching. "A peasant woman with a seat at your table? They will try to break me by day and bury me by night." "They already are," he said simply. "This way, when they strike an office, not a rumor, and every blow becomes a case." The revelation was not romantic. It was strategic, dangerous, and holy in its honesty. He was not promising safety. He was offering a battlefield where her courage had the force of law. Elira looked toward the village, where tomorrow's bread still needed baking. She thought of her father's fear, of children who slept warmer because someone opened a door in a stone wall. She thought of the word burned into the earth, kneel. Then she thought of another word, one she had carried silently for years. Rise. "I will take the seat," she said. "But hear me. I sit for them, not for you." A shadow of a smile. That is precisely why I asked. At dawn, a notice was nailed to the manor board. By decree of the Duke of Ravenshire, Elira of Southfield is appointed steward to the tenants, with full right to petition, audit, and adjudicate matters of levy and relief. The hall would gasp, the court would snarl, the village would gather, and somewhere in the capital, a hand would pause over a quill, recalculating the cost of underestimating a farmer's daughter. They brought the fight to the capital. Summoned by royal writ, the Duke stood before the Council of Lords beneath a ceiling painted with victories that belonged to dead men. Elira stood beside him, not as rumor, but as steward to the tenants, a title inked in law and hated in whispers. Carden returned polished and poisonous, flanked by two courtiers who fed on scandal like smoke, Sir Halvern of the Treasury and Lady Varel of Protocol. Their charges were simple and lethal: misuse of ducal authority, incitement of unrest, and the sweetest lie of all, sedition by a peasant acting beyond her station. "The realm runs on order," Halvern intoned. "When peasants sit in seats meant for nobles, walls crack." "The realm runs on bread," Elira answered, voice steady. "When ledgers bleed, people starve." Murmurs, disapproval, interest. Varel's fan flicked like a blade. "Charming," she purred. "But the question is not bread, it is law. You, a commoner, issued petitions and reversals as if born to seal and signet." Elira lifted a cloth-wrapped bundle and placed it on the long oak table. "The ledgers of Ravenshire. Public. Witnessed. Signed." She set down a second bundle. "And the barn steward's rolls from 3 winters prior." Her eyes found Carden. "Interesting how your numbers swell whenever the cold bites hardest." Carden smiled without teeth. "And interesting how the Duke's mercy began the very week your friendship blossomed." Halvern produced a parchment, heavy with wax. "Authorization for grain release, sealed with Ravenshire's crest, dated the eve of the fire." He let it fall to the table like a verdict. "Forgery," they claim, a convenient term. Elira did not flinch. "Heat a pin," she said. Laughter, then confusion, then curiosity. A guard brought a candle. Elira held the decree steady as the pin glowed dull red. "Real Ravenshire wax is beeswax and myrrh," she said. "It stains and recovers, cheap resin blisters." She pressed the pinhead to the seal. It puckered, bubbled, and spat a bitter scent that had no place in a chapel or a court. A ripple moved through the chamber. Halvern's jaw hardened. Varel's fan stilled. Carden's gaze slid to the clerk who had confessed in Ravenshire Hall, safe now in the capital, dressed as if honesty could be polished away. The clerk looked at the floor. The High Chancellor rapped his staff. "We debate 2 matters," he said. "The fraud is clear enough. What remains is authority. Does a duke possess the right to appoint a tenant steward with voice in estate law? And if so, does that voice trespass on the crown?" Carden seized the opening. "Your Grace," he said to the Chancellor, bowing in feigned sorrow, "grant a precedent today, and tomorrow every manor will sprout a dozen Eliras, peasants meddling in levies, petitioning councils, unseating loyal administrators. Chaos in the name of compassion." Elira stepped forward. "No," she said. "Clarity in the name of charter." She placed a thin, brittle volume on the table. The Charter of Stonemere, an old law half remembered, copied by priests and ignored by men who profited from forgetting. Enacted after the famine wars, it grants each duchy the right to name an officer from among the tenants to witness levies and report abuses directly to the ducal court. It has slept for a century under dust and convenience. We woke it. Silence like a held breath. The Chancellor turned pages with careful fingers. There it was, ink faded but legible, a promise the realm had once made to its poor when their graves grew too many to ignore. "Ancient scraps," Varel whispered. "Ritual, not rule." "Ritual is how rule remembers why it exists," the Duke said, voice cold and clean. "The law is not a wall to keep the hungry out. It is a door that proves the house is worth living in." Carden's mask cracked. "You do this for her." "I do this for them," the Duke answered, and the word filled the room more than any title. For the fields that carry your feasts, for the hands you do not see. The council chamber shifted. Some faces tightened, others softened, all of them calculating where the wind might blow in 10 winters. Halvern reached for regality. If the charter stands, he said, the crown must not. We cannot permit nobles to curry favor by staging charity as governance. Elira felt the ground tilt toward verdicts that were decided in private and dressed in public. She thought of the barn's ash, and the word burned into earth. Kneel. She did not kneel. She moved. Your graces, she said, turning not to the lords but to the scribes, the guards, the servants lining the walls, the ones who would repeat this story in kitchens and barracks. If the law remembers only the powerful, it will be remembered only by the dead. Let the charter speak today, or you will feed a fire that will learn to read. The sentence hung like a bell struck once and left to ring. The chancellor closed the charter. The law is stubborn, he said. So is hunger. I will not pretend to solve both before supper. A few courtiers smirked. He did not. But this I will state. The charter of Stonemere stands. A duke may appoint one tenant steward with voice and petition at a state court. Fraud in Ravenshire shall be tried. Lord Carden, High Chancellor, a voice cut in. Smooth, theatrical, dangerous. A royal messenger strode forward and unfurled a scarlet ribbon. By order of His Majesty's Regent, the Council will stay judgment in all matters touching Ravenshire pending a royal inquiry. The Duke is to remain in the capital. The tenant steward is to be detained for questioning. The room turned. The trap redrew itself in royal ink. Guards approached. The Duke's hand moved to his sword, then stopped on the hilt. Law over steel, for now. Elira met his eyes and shook her head once. If he drew, they both would be stories told in past tense. 2 guards reached for her arms. She did not step back. She lifted the barn ledger instead and held it like a standard. If you take me, she said, loud enough for the hall and the corridors beyond, you take the evidence with me, and when I speak, I will speak under oath. A gamble, a promise, a threat wrapped in obedience. The Chancellor's gaze flicked to the messenger, then to the watching room. Too many listeners for a quiet disappearance. Too many witnesses for a convenient fall. Detained, he said at last, each syllable carved from practicality. Not silenced. The steward will be held in the city barracks under council protection until inquiry convenes. Carden's smile chilled. The Duke's jaw set. Elira exhaled only when the shackles closed with a click that sounded very much like the start of a new war. As they led her away, the Duke spoke, not to stop the guards, but to promise something the hall could not unhear. Ravenshire does not kneel, he said. Elira turned her head just enough for her voice to carry back. Ravenshire rises. And the court, for a single stunned heartbeat, believed it. The cell was cold, but Elira had known colder. She sat straight, her hands folded over the ledgers she refused to release. Guards whispered outside, uncertain whether she was a prisoner or a herald. To some, she was still a peasant girl caught in a nobleman's shadow. To others, she had become something rarer. Proof that voices born in the fields could echo in marble halls. The Duke visited once, beneath the watch of 2 councilmen. He did not touch her hand, nor speak of longing. He simply asked, "Are you afraid?" She answered honestly, "Yes, but fear doesn't mean silence." He bowed his head, the gesture shocking in its humility. "Then your courage has already done what mine could not. It has made the court remember who feeds its throne." Days turned into weeks. Rumors multiplied. In taverns, they whispered of a farmer's daughter who faced lords with nothing but truth. In villages, children played at being the steward, lifting sticks like ledgers, shouting at imagined nobles. And in Ravenshire itself, the people stood taller when they spoke her name. The inquiry loomed, the regent's shadow stretching long. But one truth could not be undone. Elira had risen from the dirt, and in rising, she had lifted others with her. Perhaps love would come later, in moments stolen or battles won together. Perhaps it would be shattered by the very walls that now watched her. Yet whether she walked free or remained bound, Elira had already defied the word burned into the earth. She had shown the kingdom another word entirely, one it had forgotten it could speak. Rise. The inquiry came and went, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. Carden's frauds unraveled under testimony. His allies abandoned him when profit soured. Elira was released, not pardoned, but recognized. The title of steward remained, written now in ink too public to erase. The Duke returned to Ravenshire with her at his side, not as a mistress in shadow, but as a partner in law. In time, respect softened into affection, and affection into love that neither crown nor council could deny. Yet their story was not remembered as a romance first. It was remembered as a revolution of dignity, sparked by a farmer's daughter who refused to kneel. And so, when the kingdom spoke her name, it was not in whispers of scandal, but in the steady cadence of hope. Elira, the girl who rose. Elira, who taught even dukes to listen. What would you do if the world told you to bow? Would you accept the chains, or would you rise? If you believe in more stories of courage, love, and defiance, subscribe now to Royal Forbidden Tales and step into a world where every tale dares to break the silence.